So I just got off a call with an elite coach. First time I'd ever spoken with this coach. And they were sharing with me the struggles of their most recent season. Now, this coach had played over a decade professionally and coached at the Division I level as an assistant coach for many years. So they have had some experience, however, no head coaching experience until the last few years. So now they're in this head coaching position these last few years, and experiences are new and they're difficult. And this coach is reflecting on the most recent season, talking to me about how challenging it is. And I heard multiple times the coach say, I'm realizing that's not me. Like coaching that way, it's not me. And there was this other moment later in the conversation where they were talking about another challenge. And I remember them saying, not feeling good about the way they handled it as a coach. And once again, they said something like, I recognize that's not who I am as a coach. That's not who I want to be as a coach. So I shared this back with the coach, what I was hearing. And we talked about this tough reality that to truly know ourselves as a coach and as a leader, we've got to go through some shit, right? We've got to go through some experiences, and they're not always positive experiences. However, just going through experience is enough. Like experience with reflection leads to self-discovery, especially in the theme of today's conversation. Now, when it comes to knowing ourselves as a leader, as a person, we've got to have that experience and reflection. But I guess after today's call with that coach, I was like, is there another way to really know ourselves without all the painful failures, embarrassments, and shame? And maybe not entirely, but yes, definitely there's a way to not have to fail a million times, maybe to really better understand ourselves. And that's really when we talk about today's conversation with Nate, Betsy, and myself, and in my new book, The Culture Captain, I think I try to hit on this. I try to provide a framework for people. And it kind of comes back to a quote that I shared from Adam Grant, author of Think Again. He says, the best way to find yourself isn't looking inward to see who you are sometimes. It's looking outward to see who you admire. Role models help you to identify what you value and who you want to become. And I would extend this quote to say, looking at those role models and understanding their experiences, their lived experiences, then pulling that back and reflecting it. And I think that's the power of story. Story allows us to learn from others' experience, and then we can take their experiences, the role models, and use them to reflect more deeply on our own experiences. Let me explain this a little bit more deeply. I think simply being, do I need to win a championship to realize how unfulfilling being obsessed with winning it all and then finally winning it all won't actually fulfill me? Do I need to actually go and win the championship? No. There's plenty of coaches and athletes who've actually done the work beforehand. They've heard the stories. They reflect on what's most important to them. They've come to understand this truth. And so they're able to course correct and not have this unhealthy obsession with winning it all and to pursue championships in a way that is fulfilling. But then there's also the people who hear the stories and they don't learn from the stories, which is why my new book, The Culture Captain, isn't just filled with stories of elite athletes or stories of everyday athletes that have worked through these challenges, right? The fable portion of the book weaves together everyday athletes that I've been able to coach, as well as the elite stories or stories of elite athletes. But the book also has guidance. It's got tools to help us reflect on those stories and our own personal experiences, to do the work first, so that we can know ourselves, so that we can lead ourselves, then we can lead others, and then we can eventually lead the team, which is the 4 levels of leadership: know yourself, lead others, and then lead the team. And today on the podcast, Nate, Betsy, and I had a really great conversation about some of the important ideas that came up for all of us as we read my new book, The Culture Captain. So welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. This podcast, as I've shared the last few weeks, is ad-free because of listeners like you who don't just listen, but they join TOC, our online community, courses and coaching, and they also purchase books like Betsy's book, my book, The Culture Captain. But I would just say this: don't just join TOC or don't just buy this book to support the podcast, right? Obviously that helps us to do what we do, but do it because we have to move beyond just being consumers of content. It's not enough just to listen to a podcast and expect change to happen. We need to move beyond that information, and we need to use that information, the good information, hopefully on this podcast that you think is valuable. But to really experience transformation, there has to be reflection, there has to be coaching, there has to be training, there has to be practicing, right? We have to really go beyond just consuming content today. And that's what I love doing. That's what I love doing, is working with coaches in that way. So the book is out. The Culture Captain books is out Tuesday, June 9th, 2026. So be sure to be on the lookout for the book if you're listening to this when it releases. Enough of that. Let's jump into my conversation with Nate and Betsy. So today's conversation for our listeners is going to be focusing on the first part of the book, which is level 1, know yourself. Now, I'll just throw it to you, Betsy, Nate. I've got a few bullet points, things that I'd love to talk about, but I want to kind of just throw it to you, Betsy, actually, to kick it off here, of just, as you're reading that first part of the book, I don't know, what came up for you?
Well, even just like, I didn't make it past level 1, know yourself, before thinking like, man, when was the first time in my life where I was truly invited to articulate who I am? And then I was thinking about, having 2 young kids, and my oldest is about to start kindergarten in a couple months. And we've been reading transition books about preschool. And I think about Grover's mom telling Grover, like, you'll be great. Just be yourself. Right. And like, we say that all the time, be yourself, be yourself. But it begs the question, who are you? And that's a really challenging question. And so I think that a couple of things came up for me. One, I was reflecting on, when was I first truly challenged to know myself? 2, I started thinking about how many people of all ages, separate from sports, separate from quote leaders, ever truly move through this level and take the journey of getting to know themselves. Is it forced? Is it chosen? Is it something everybody does, or is it largely something that only people who are intentional about things like leadership do? So those are a few things that came up for me.
It's interesting because my daughter just moved schools. All 3 of my kids moved schools for academic reasons, for the environment reasons. We loved the previous school, the people in the school, but we had to make a tough family decision to move schools. And it was a really difficult week last week as we kind of moved in the middle of the school year. But my daughter came back, and everything about the school, in many ways, it ticks the boxes as a better school. And yet she was struggling with, because she said she couldn't be herself. And I was
Hmm.
like, hmm, what does that even mean? Like, for a 10-year-old. And I thought it was a pretty profound comment about how she felt around this new group of girls that she was around. But interesting that even she was starting to think about those things. And maybe that's something to do with the fact that she's kind of been exposed to some of the things from the book. I don't know.
Hmm. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think the earliest time that I was invited to like define myself. It was probably part of like a school project, like a family history or like a biography of yourself. Or um, I think probably that was like one of the earliest pathways. And I know we've talked before about, Nate and I going through the New Ventures West program. I think at 27, that was the first time I was truly, truly invited to do like a self inventory and get really real and raw with who I was at that point and who I wanted to become, who I wanted to leave behind, that sort of thing. So, and that was because I was part of that program. So, if not for that program, aside from writing a Bumble profile, which apparently was descriptive enough to meet my now wife, I wasn't really asked to define like, who are you? Who are you in the eyes of the world? And is that the same or different from who you take yourself to be?
It's interesting you asked that question about when people start to think about that. Like, I think there is a sense of, I just watching our own kids, they're 8 and 11, going on 11 this summer. Um, where there might not be an articulation of like, here's who I am, but I can recognize the moments when I'm not comfortable sharing a part of myself or showing a
Mm,
piece of me. And I find that interesting to be sort of the first instinct is protection in a sense before maybe even articulation, just in sort of how we arrive in this world and start to navigate the world, socially. But I think there's probably some truth to that in showing up as an athlete and learning how to be a leader as well, that would probably keep parts of ourself from being seen out of you know, safety. Is this a safe environment? How am I going to be received sort of thing? And that I'm sure does keep people from taking steps of courage into leadership, especially young people that haven't maybe wrestled with these questions before.
Yeah, I'm always interested too in how like social media might shape this for individuals. 'Cause like your point, Betsy, around creating a profile. Like the very act of creating a profile on, let's say, even LinkedIn, the least of maybe the social media, you know, sites. But the whole thing is like, how do I want to be portrayed by the world?
Mm,
How do I want others to see me? It's not. They're not asking you, well, what's most important to you as a human being? Like you're not. Well, what do you value? It's the whole act of creating a social media profile is how do you want others to see you? And I think those are two very different questions, right? Like,
mhm,
uh, and so I wonder how early on, like even just as like, let's say my daughter going to that new school, it's like, okay, who are you? What is important to you? What's important to us as a family? And how do we want to show up? No matter what the social norms are within that school. And then within the social
mm,
norms, you recognize that, okay, hey, they do little things a little bit differently on this side of town, and there's different things. So you you do kind of maybe change certain things, but but that's really, really complex for a 10-year-old to understand, much less a 25 to 39-year-old to 50-year-old coach that moves from one context to the next, or an athlete that goes from high school to Division 1, or a middle schooler goes to high school. Like, who am I? But also, how do I adapt to the context that I'm in?
mhm. You're talking, JP, and I'm thinking something that Nate brought up before, um, on a team that I had started working with in the past year. I noticed as some of the athletes started to follow me on social media, when I looked at their profiles, a lot of them simply had like child of God or, in his glory or like some reference to religion or spirituality. And it was a high volume of players on this team. And I remember reflecting back to the coach, like, hey, I notice on your player profiles that you have a lot of, deeply religious or spiritual individuals. And it was interesting because the coach said, I thought that was interesting too, because I don't hear or see that often within my team. Like it's not part of like our day to day, it from people wearing, cross necklaces or, saying prayers before games. They said it doesn't really show up. So I asked one of the athletes, and what the athlete told that coach was, as a child of God, I don't have to describe myself further because in his eyes, I'm enough. And we're talking about this identity as like who do I want others to see me as, and who do I take myself to be, which can be different questions. There might not be that alignment yet for an individual, especially a young person. But I thought that was really interesting in this like world where there is pressure to define yourself as your brand, right? And then put it on social platforms for the world to consume and judge or approve of. Um, is there this cry for like, let me be me, and can I say less and simply be enough? And that question of enoughness, I know, is a challenge for people of all ages. But I thought that was really interesting that it wasn't like I am necessarily deeply religious. It's that in this way, I don't need to explain further. And I can rest in enoughness, even just for a moment in this space. I thought that was really interesting.
Mhm.
Well, JP's, I was going back through the book again for, a second time here, and was fortunate to be on the reading team, as you were writing. I wonder if there is space, or needs to be a level zero in this leadership process. I mean, we're going to obviously get into more detail about kind of what level one looks like and how do we usher athletes through this idea of self-discovery. But I was doing a facilitation not too long ago, working with some student athletes, and kind of the purpose of being there was just to help develop, plant some seeds for leaders to start to emerge in some of the programs at the school. And a couple things really surprised me in the conversations that we had with the players and with the athletes. And they were 8th grade through 12th grade, so all ages. We had one group of boys, one group of girls, and it was really just kind of exploring like what they think about leadership, what their perceptions are of, leaders, um, the things that would prevent them from wanting to be a leader. And walking out of those conversations, like I was really surprised at their responses. Like they were totally unexpected to me. So a couple things came out of these conversations. Number one, very few of them had ever experienced someone they would consider to be a good leader as a peer on one of their teams. So normally when we start, these leadership conversations, it's like, well, let's talk about somebody, your favorite leader, somebody that you've been around that's led a team, and they didn't really have a strong example of someone that they could think of. So I'm like, okay, well that doesn't work. And then when we start talking about, well, all right, what is leadership? Like, why is it important? Crickets. Like they couldn't, the three of us and the coaches that are listening would sit here and say, look, you can't be a great team if you don't have player leadership, end of story, right? We assume that everybody believes that. But these athletes, because they hadn't experienced it, they couldn't tell you the difference between being on a team with great leadership and a team that never had any leadership, other than coach-led leadership. So they didn't even have a context for like why it matters and how it impacts a team and, that sort of thing. And then the third thing, when we asked them, we started to explore that a little bit, and I gave them a couple examples, and we left with these exit tickets of like, what's the biggest thing that holds you back from, thinking about being a leader at some point in your career? And the most common answer was, I don't want to be seen as bossy. That came up on 3/4 of the surveys in some fashion or another, that players don't want to be seen as bossy. So what that tells me, at least in this context, I put all this together, is that players don't necessarily understand or have experience with great peer leadership. So they don't know the value of it. And so if they don't know why it matters and they haven't seen it, they don't have an example of being led themselves, or being on a team where it's mattered. That's a whole different conversation than know yourself. And the perception of leadership, I don't want to be seen as bossy and all the social ramifications for that. That's also very different from lead yourself. So I don't
Mhm.
know. What do you guys think? Is there space for a level 0 here where there almost has to be some pre-work about what leadership actually is and why it matters before you can start to dive into level 1?
But don't you think like at some point the leadership, like I think there's like so many very definitions of leadership based upon people's different leadership philosophy, based upon the needs, based on the role that you're in and how you lead. So like but we try to over maybe simplify it. I don't know if that rings true in this case.
I'm gonna put you on the spot, JP. What if someone said, JP, what's your definition of leadership? How would you describe or define leadership?
I don't really think I have one. Like, I don't know if I really have one. That seems weird because I wrote a book about leadership and I don't have this like clear, like
But I'm
crystal
asking
clear
in part
definition.
because
Yeah.
I don't either. Like if somebody asked me that, I don't know how I would answer that. And a question a coach asked me recently because they were trying to decide between investing in communication training for their team or investing in leadership training. And the question they asked me during the interview process was, what role does leadership play in the work that you do on communication? And my answer was an essential one. I think it would be very challenging to be a great leader or have strong leadership within your team without quality communication skills. Because the ability to connect with other people, to connect with yourself, to hold space for conversations, to ask questions that move the needle, all that relates to communication and is a function and facet of leadership. So for me, leadership is a core component, or communication is a foundational piece of leadership. But if somebody said, how would you define leadership? I don't have an answer top of mind.
I think mine just came up was just like be a good person.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but like for me, it's like the whole book isn't really necessarily about like what to do when you're a captain. I mean, though it goes into those types of things, but it's all about like if we like because I feel like you're called to lead in everything that you do within life, right? Whether it's your family, you're a coach, you're a starter, you're the captain, you're the end of the bench. Like there's some aspect of this knowing yourself, leading yourself, and then that interpersonal leading others and how you can be, we all have influence. And so leadership comes down so often about how we wield our influence. And so, I mean, being a good person, maybe that's a really crappy definition, but it's just more like, to me, it's like wielding good influence, right? Like we all have
Mm.
influence. We're all going to have impact in this world. And so we can all do something to have a positive influence, or we could choose to have a negative influence in every aspect, every moment, right, of our lives.
And to your point, Nate, like that three-fourths said, I don't want to be seen as bossy. And without context, without a concrete example and a good example of what leadership looks like among peers, it's likely, especially for younger kids, that their experience of leadership has been the person that was bossy, the person that told them what to do among their peer group, or the person that, picked teams or the game that they're playing or was in charge, probably felt bossy. And so if that's the leadership that they've seen, most people don't want any part of that. Um, but I think that's I want to say like fascinating, but also maybe a little concerning. What came out of the work that you did during that facilitation, and it makes me wonder, are we assuming, even with positive intent, like are we assuming that kids today understand what leadership is and why it's important, or do we need to back it up a little bit in order to create more of that foundational understanding before we invite them into level one of knowing themselves?
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, but interesting, JP. The entry point that we kind of scrambled to, you know, because all the shit that I had planned was not going to work. They had, no
Isn't that
context
fun?
that we were talking about.
Uh,
Is we started with that idea of influence, and just
Mm.
how have you seen
mm,
peers influence the behavior of others, for example, in the classroom or, whatever. Um, and it tried to get them to land on this place of like leadership is really using your influence on purpose to
mm.
make
Mm.
this team better or to make someone else's experience better, something like that. So, we could finally, sort of find this place of connection on this idea that of peer influence. And then leaders, they try to do it on purpose in a way that helps the team. And I went to the example from the 2016 World Series where, the Cubs give up the 2-run homer, they go to the rain delay. What happens in the 16 minutes, between when they're waiting for the 10th inning to start? That's when leadership emerges, and we watched the example of Dexter Fowler or Jason Hayward, giving this dramatic speech or whatever. And we talked about how that could go sideways if there was just influence based on how somebody felt in the moment or whatever. So anyway, there are places to, I think, still engage, right? And start to build this scaffold as to what leadership is and why it matters. I was just surprised at how little groundwork there was naturally in that room on that particular day.
Nate, I'm currently here in Denver at the Women Coaches Academy, sponsored by We Coach and the NCAA. And after my session yesterday, a coach came up to me and she was talking about how her team is rebuilding and they don't have a lot of leaders. And she mentioned a situation where she has a junior with a really magnetic personality. And they've got 13 freshmen coming in because it's a rebuilding situation. And what she said to that junior before they left for the summer, she said, "You've got a really magnetic personality. How are you using that in a positive way for the team?" And I guess the kid like went and thought about it and came back and was like, at first I was wondering if you were criticizing like something that I value about myself, but I recognize that you're asking me like to be intentional about how I use that quality. And she said, yes, because when 13 freshmen come in and they see and gravitate towards a magnetic personality, what influence are you having? If they come to you with a complaint about drama or something, are you feeding into that? Like, oh yeah, like I can't believe coach said that. Or are you redirecting in it in a way that is positive for the team? Um, and so getting into that level one, like know yourself, even taking one quality that someone knows to be true about themselves, and then layering in your definition, Nate, of using your influence on purpose. It's like, okay, this thing about you, how do you use that quality, which influences other people, for the purpose of adding value to our team? And maybe that's a foundational start point for developing leadership, or at least the concept of how we can lead in certain situations.
Oh, so what you just shared, I mean, we're talking a little bit about kind of like awareness with that story. I felt like Betsy, which is like
Mm,
that coach is trying to help them be aware of their influence, which is part of
yeah.
knowing yourself. I talk about in the book. I actually just something came up for me when you asked that question around, well, how would you define leadership? The first was like, oh shit, I'm supposed to have an answer to this. But then it was
I'm an
also like
imposter. Yeah.
an imposter. But like it's one of the reasons I love these conversations with the both of you because we get to explore this. And then that came up a question was around was Nate was talking about was like, okay, it's influence and leadership. Like, what's the difference? And then I loved how Nate's facilitation brought those individuals to a definition of leadership around how we use our influence, which I think is really, really, really powerful. And I think without awareness that we have an influence and that we can be intentional and we can choose how we wield that influence, whether we have a
Mhm.
magnetic personality like that girl, or we're like Joey Votto, which I talk about in the book, which is like later in the book, which is he recognized he had influence and then just showing up and it was more than just hitting home runs and being a great, you know, baseball player. Like it was how he showed up as a teammate. And he could choose to ignore that influence and miss out on opportunities to have a greater impact on the team and even the world, right? Which he's learned to have a greater impact in the world with his, giftings. And so I think it's such an important piece there.
Mhm. Well, and that know yourself, that whole phrase is about awareness, self-awareness, before we even get to influence or impact on others, and then using it for purpose, like, or on purpose, um, instead of, I guess, on accident or just, you know,
Mhm.
seeing what happens. Yeah, that I really like where we've landed with the definition of leadership and how to start to create that awareness. Because I hear that from coaches much more frequently than I used to. We just don't have any true leaders, right? And then I also hear, Nate, to your point about I don't want to be bossy, even college age athletes saying, well, I don't necessarily want to be a captain, like, or I don't want the burden or responsibility of leadership. I just want to focus on me and play my game. Um,
Mhm.
and why did leadership become such a burden? And I even think about, like, at an early age, it's so easy for a kid to take a chance and lead in some way. And because that's uncomfortable, or even because others are jealous that they were that brave, they get made fun of. And then it reinforces the like, no, you don't want to be a leader.
Here's a question I have for the two of you because one of my fears in writing a book around like this, especially this part one of like knowing yourself and discovering your leadership philosophy, is that it can feel too prescriptive.
Mm,
So there's many different ways that we talk about in the book where you're a biker, Kate Courtney kind of experiences adversity. Pete Carroll gets fired from his job, right? Steve Kerr, before he takes the job. But there's like there's different ways people come at that leadership philosophy. How did you both kind of, and you probably don't have it finished. It's always changing, evolving. I get that, but yeah, what was that process like for you all in knowing yourself and having that philosophy on life and leadership?
I don't know that I've, to your point, JP, I don't know that I have like a philosophy on leadership the way we would have like a coaching philosophy. The closest thing I can articulate in the moment to answer that question is I believe leadership is a boat that anyone can board, if you have the desire to develop that awareness, to know yourself, to use your influence on purpose. Um, yeah, I think my philosophy, if I had to say one, is if you'd like to be a leader or develop leadership qualities and capacities, the door is wide open, and to start
Mm,
with self. Um, and that leadership is good leadership is needed, especially at this time in the world, not just in sport, but just like to have, to quote Brene and Adam Grant, like strong, grounded leaders that can be demanding without being demeaning. Just even if you never use it in part of a team or organization, like to understand more about yourself to the point that you have the ability to use your influence on purpose, should you choose to do so. What a great journey to take. And yet not an easy one. So when you say, I worry that it feels too prescriptive, what came up for me first was, I think oftentimes people need the prescription. Like I need a professional, like a doctor, to prescribe how I'm going to go about like this medication of, creating awareness and discovering who I am. Because when left to your own devices, it's complex and hard. So having clear exercises that people can lean into, whether they do them all or they do a few, to be able to start to generate that awareness about who they are and how they might lead. I don't think it's too prescriptive. I think it's a positive, supportive framework for people who are curious about the work but don't know where to start.
What about core values? Like you've got core values. How did you land on those?
Brene Brown, she asked in Dare to Lead, she said, you have to pick 2 core values. So of course I picked 4. And yeah, it was
that simple.
Love, integrity, curiosity, and joy. And then when I was reading Strong Ground, I was like, that's you really, like, you need to stop cheating. Like, just pick 2. And so I thought about those 4 and ended with love and integrity. Because when I'm operating in my integrity, I'm more likely to feel joy. When I'm leading with love and integrity, I'm naturally curious. So love, integrity, curiosity, and joy. Whittling it down to 2, it's love and integrity.
And so for you, like, was it just like looking at the list and like, these were words that I love, or these words that just really resonate the most with me?
Oh, it was more, the list helped. Again, to your point about being too prescriptive, the list definitely helped. And then thinking about who I am, where I feel most alive. Like I've always loved watching people who I describe as being in their element, like doing the thing they were uniquely made to do. And when I think about myself in that space, because I do feel very much like I am living my purpose in the work that I do, there's so much alignment there for me in a variety of ways. When I think about like, what is that really about? Or what does that involve specifically? It involves all those things. Like it involves love, it involves integrity, it involves joy, it involves curiosity. And that's what I value about what I do, but also how I show up when I do what I do, like the human doing versus the human being that you talk about in level 1. And so for me, those made sense in terms of I value these things. I live these values consistently. And so for me, the answer to what are your values, like that made sense for me.
See, I love integrity. I love your values first off, right? But I love integrity, but I'm also like, yeah, these are my values and integrity is me living in my values. So I'm like, I'm just going to cheat and not use it as one of my 2.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I cheated and had 4, right? So yeah, we're all cheaters. Cheaters, liars, thieves, and something else. Yeah. There's a good toast in there somewhere that I can't remember right now.
What about you, Nate?
Well, I'll answer this in 2 ways. I think for me, the deliberate process was, before I took my last job and was trying to figure out like what's the foundation that we want to build the program on. It was looking back over, 18 years of experience at that point, and like, I guess trying to describe who we are most consistently, and so those words of gratitude, effort, and love, like couldn't I couldn't lead a program without trying to do those things. So that was kind of it for us. And I had listened to TJ Rosine talk a lot about like finding his values, at Emmanuel and through PGC and stuff. And so that was helpful, just like, kind of reflecting on his story a little bit too. I think what's hard for, for coaches, maybe as they're listening to this or they're reading the book, is like, this is tricky enough for me. Like, how do you usher a 15-year-old into this? What's your 3 core values or your philosophy of, being a player or an athlete or whatever? And one activity that we did a number of years ago that actually was pretty good about like starting this conversation is we did a team dinner, and each of the coaches was supposed to bring in a soup in a different crock pot. And so we had soup supper, and then the kids were broken up into teams, and each one was assigned a crock pot, and they were supposed to come up with all the ingredients that went into that soup. And then they were supposed to list them in proportionality. So the most to the least, right? And so in this contest, so to speak, like, we're sort of having a fun way of introducing this idea that as a team, everybody sort of brings a different flavor to this soup. And if you were to take out the parsley, that might have been forgotten, there would be a subtle difference in the taste of the overall thing that you've put together in this crock pot, right? And so when we started asking kids, the days that you're not at practice, our soup tastes different. How? Right? Like,
Mm.
what's the flavor that you
Mm.
want to leave behind, or you want your teammates to miss, to notice when it's not there? And that starts a conversation in, well, I want to be positive. I want to give good energy. I want to be somebody they can count, And so it was kind of a good entry point in the sort of a fun way, to get them to start thinking about what is their ingredient in the soup of whatever this thing is that we're becoming together.
I love that. It's a really beautiful way, like a metaphor to highlight what someone values and like what do they want to bring to the world? What do they want to bring to the team? That really comes back to not just necessarily from a aspirational place, but as you spoke about, Nate, and Betsy spoke about as well, which is like it's a little bit of looking forward and looking backward. Like, okay, how do I want to show up for my team? But I got to look back. I got to look back in like when I'm at my best, when I feel most at peace, when I feel most content, when I feel most truly myself. What what does that look like? Like, what are those words that I use? What's important to me? Like, and you start to like, I talk about unearthing. Like, you're just like, okay, like through the looking back, you can start to say, okay, how do I bring that forward? And offer it as a gift to my team, to the world, right?
Mm. Yeah, I love that exercise, Nate. And I'm like, man, I would be like really hard pressed to know the ingredients in a soup. Like I look at my spice cabinet, I'm like, I know you all do things, magical things. I don't know how to use you, right? So, um, it was reminding me when I first left coaching and started doing the work that I do now. Tara Vanderveer was kind enough to invite me back to Stanford to do a workshop with her team. And the workshop we did, I called Championship Soup. And because I love arts and crafts, I got a ton of glitter, like all different colors. And then each player got this little vial and they picked what color their ingredient was going to be. So what's the quality that you consistently bring to the team that adds value in our championship pursuit? And I had this big cauldron, kind of like your crock pot. And so once each player identified their color of glitter and their quality, they took turns like putting their ingredient into the pot. And we stirred it all around. And then what they ended up taking with them in their vials was some of that soup, all mixed together with all the different sparkles. Um, I think it's such a lovely way to like use a metaphor and an experience to then set up a conversation. Even that question, like, how, right? Like our team, our soup is different on the days you're not there. How? Like that's a very different way at getting at the same answer without saying, Nate, tell me what your values are. It's like, what? Right. But it's like, how are we different when you're not there? That feels a lot more accessible, I think, for people maybe of any age. So I love that you did that.
Mm. There, I know you had love and effort were your values for so long. And then you added gratitude, which went gratitude, effort, and love, which was GEL, which was a cool acronym. But
Mm.
you didn't do it because it was just a cool acronym. What felt missing? And how did you realize, like, no, no, we're missing one. I got to go with a third one here. Gratitude is missing from these values that I bring to the team.
Well, I think that's again one I stole from TJ because his down at Emmanuel is gratitude and attitude, is the thing on their practice jerseys and they talk about all the time. And that's really where I started thinking about, the importance of being grateful and appreciating the opportunities that you have and the people that have made this possible. And, when we think about treating people right, which obviously is a manifestation of lots of values, but like I think about officials, and am I grateful that they are here? Because if they weren't, we would not be playing, or the bus drivers or the janitors or the shot clock operator, or, like there's just so many people that invest in the community of a program, that I just felt it was so important for us to be appreciative of that. And it just felt like it fit into, who we were. I mean, we were practicing that without necessarily articulating in that way. But listening to TJ talk about how important it was to his program really pushed me over the edge to add it on, for ours.
JP, there's a part in level 1 where you talk about, I think the phrase was, success without fulfillment is failure. And how you give some great examples of athletes that were very high achieving, like achieved the highest level within their sport and were miserable, right? And I think that we see it often of people of all ages, of when I do or get X, then I will feel or experience Y. And we've had conversations even here on the podcast about how when we flip those, like when I feel or experience blank, I'm more likely to do or get, blank. The question that came up for me that I wanted to ask you and Nate is, when is a time in your life where you have achieved success, but it lacked fulfillment and therefore not necessarily felt like a failure, but when did you achieve like a high level of success and yet feel unfulfilled?
As an athlete, playing
It could be in any
Division I
context, but
basketball. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for me as an athlete, it was playing Division I basketball. And I still struggle to unpack that, like making a team at South Carolina and, living the dream, right? Growing up in Columbia, you're playing there, you're in the arena. And the immature JP probably would be like, well, it's because you're not actually playing, but that just becomes the mountain of achievement, right? Well, okay, you make the team. Now if you can just play meaningful minutes. Well, now if I can be a starter, now if I can be the star, which was never going to happen. Was not very good. But somehow made the team. And I would say there's probably a cocktail things of like not feeling like I really belonged, not feeling like I mattered within the team, to maybe actually not feeling like I was living in my values. I didn't know what my values were at the time, but like, I was caught up in the publicity of that, having made the team. And I would say my effort and my preparation waned, caught up in the partying scene of like just trying to enjoy those types of things. So that definitely stole from it. Whereas you compare it, like now when I talk about my athletic accomplishments, that's probably the one that most people would be most impressed with. But I'm actually like, I don't really like to share it that much because I actually don't have a strong sense of pride around that. Whereas the level of fulfillment that I did finishing a 200-kilometer ultra with 10 people at the finish line, 4 of them being my family, one of them being my best friend, and another 5 people that happened to hang around till the end. Like that is, to me, like was the most fulfilling thing because of the effort that went into and the people that supported me and along the journey. And just, it was so much an enjoyable journey for me. So very, very different experiences for me, for sure.
Yeah. Nate, what about you? A time you've experienced success, but the fulfillment wasn't there?
I don't know if I really have a great example of that. I was actually thinking of it a little the other way of like, it meant too much, like when chasing a state championship means too much, like it's almost like, yeah, I don't know how to explain that very well in the last 30 seconds of a podcast, but I think there is, all things in moderation, right? Like there's a balance to all of this, where I think of the example, JP talked about Andre Agassi, and he builds this academy for kids in Las Vegas and like has this new purpose in tennis. But even something that is, that is good and changes the world can become addictive. Like it can become a second school. It can become, this is Andre Agassi, he's changed the lives of this many thousand people, like, so there's a whole issue of attachment here. That's probably another podcast, some other time, but, um, yeah, but I think that's, maybe the most important thing is that fulfillment has to be defined by you,
Mm.
and the meaning has to be made intentionally rather than just by what we're influenced, by what we see and what we hear and that sort of thing.
Mm.
And two things come up for me, Nate. I feel like when you said, like winning a state championship, like caring too much. And I think about what JP writes in the book about the identity prison versus the identity house. And what also comes up for me is the book talks about, defining success, redefining success. And when I was reading that section, I realized how frequently success is defined for us before we ever have an opportunity to define it for ourselves. And then even when we have an opportunity to define it for ourselves, how much of our definition is based off of what we were told or taught success should be from the people of influence in our life. Yeah. So again, longer conversation, curious questions. But I appreciate both of you sharing.
Well, I appreciate the question too, because I went as far back as my days as an athlete. And yet I would say I really enjoyed the process of writing this book. And I found the work really fulfilling. Every morning I
Mm.
was pumped. I was excited to get in and do the work. I have, hopes, aspirations for the success of the book, but I could say I at least enjoyed the journey. What I also will be very vulnerable and say is, honestly, the last, and you both know this, the last 6 to 9 months have been a very challenging personal time for me as I've been writing the book, where I have overextended myself because of opportunities that many would say are success. The opportunity to work with teams, the opportunity to work with high level coaches. And in that overcommitment, some of the fulfillment started to wane. And some of this, you start to be, it almost feels like more of an obligation than an opportunity to serve and support and have an impact and have a positive influence in the world. And it's kind of to Nate's point, you purpose. There's a bit of a dark side to purpose, which is why I really have appreciated Brett Stolberg's work around values. At times, we can really get caught up in our purpose, and we become, the hero. We become like this big thing of like, how many lives can I change? How many people are going to come to my wedding or will invite me to their wedding someday, right? Like that type of thing as a coach. And I think that those type of things are dangerous metrics at times to mess around with, especially in today's world, which is so transactional. And you could be doing an amazing job and living in your values and totally on mission, and people not appreciate that purpose at all at times, and fire you. So yeah, no, I really appreciate the question, Betsy, and I felt like I had actually had a responsibility to answer that honestly, which is that, yeah, there's times lately that I've achieved success, but I haven't felt a lot of fulfillment in it.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate that.
All right, so there was so much good in that episode. In many ways, I felt like I actually left on a cliffhanger. I ended up calling Nate and talking to him more later on the next day, kind of around those ideas around pursuing purpose. Like we can actually start to obsess over purpose, and that can become unhealthy and ineffective at times. So we're probably going to have to do another episode on that. Thanks again for listening to today's episode. If you're listening to this on June 7th or 8th, you can pre-order the book on ebook, or if it's already June 9th, 2026 or later, go ahead and get the book on paperback or ebook today. You can head on over to theculturecaptain.net just to hear about some of the other kind of endorsements that I've gotten from great coaches like the Dusty May. We have Brad Stolberg, Daniel Coyle. They've all really honored me by reading the book beforehand. So you can head over to culturecaptain.net or just search The Culture Captain on Amazon.